This is a story about a young man who walked into the Amazon jungle looking for adventure and spent 3 weeks alone inside it, trying to find his way back out. Yossi Ghinsberg was 22 years old and certain he was built for this. He had just completed 3 years of service in the Israeli Navy, was the child of Holocaust survivors, had worked construction in Norway, fished in Alaska, and unloaded trucks in New York to save enough money to do the one thing he had wanted to do since adolescence: explore the unexplored. Not the Amazon of tourist maps and guidebooks, the real Amazon, the uncharted interior, the places where the canopy was so thick it blocked the sky and the silence between sounds was a sound of its own. He arrived in Bolivia in late 1981, hitchhiking from Venezuela through Colombia, carrying a small prayer booklet in Aramaic that his uncle Nissim, a Kabbalist and rabbi, had given him before dying. Nissim told him the book had protected him through the Holocaust. He died 45 minutes after pressing it into Yossi's hands. Yossi carried it anyway. He was that kind of young man, drawn to significance, drawn to story, in love with the idea of himself as a person for whom extraordinary things happened. In La Paz, he found what he was looking for. A man named Karl Ruprechter, Austrian, confident, weathered in the way of someone who had spent years in rough places, approached him with a proposition. There was a remote indigenous village deep in the Bolivian jungle, uncontacted territory, gold rumored in the earth. Karl knew the way. He just needed people willing to go. Yossi signed on immediately. So did Marcus Stam, a Swiss schoolteacher Yossi had been traveling with, and Kevin Gale, an American photographer from Oregon who had been about to fly home for Thanksgiving and changed his mind at the last moment. 4 men, 4 nationalities, 4 different reasons for being there. They flew to Apollo, traveled down to the Tuichi River, and began moving into the jungle. The warnings had been there from the beginning. Bolivian locals at the villages they passed through told them the jungle ahead was impassable, that the rainy season was already beginning, that the river would be dangerous. Karl waved these concerns away with the authority of a man who had done this before. He hadn't. They would discover this slowly, the way you discover that the ground beneath you is not solid, not in one moment, but in a series of small subsidences, each one slightly worse than the last. After 2 weeks inside the jungle, everything Karl had promised had failed to materialize. There was no hidden village. There was no gold. There was only the jungle, wet, relentless, indifferent, and 4 increasingly desperate men running short on food and short on trust. It emerged, in the way these things emerge when people are hungry and frightened, that Karl Ruprechter was not a geologist. He was not an expert guide. He was a drifter and a fantasist who had led 4 people into one of the most dangerous environments on Earth on the strength of stories he had invented. Marcus, who had been struggling physically for days, could barely walk. The group was fracturing. They split. Karl and Marcus would continue on foot toward a town Karl believed was within reach. Yossi and Kevin would build a raft and attempt to navigate the Tuichi River back to civilization. The 4 men agreed to meet in La Paz. They said their goodbyes. Karl and Marcus walked into the trees. They were never seen again. Yossi and Kevin built their raft and pushed out onto the Tuichi. For a while it worked. The river moved fast, carrying them forward, the jungle banks passing in a green blur on either side. Then the river changed. The current accelerated. The sound ahead shifted from water on rocks to something else entirely. The deep, low roar of a waterfall, still around the bend, already too close. Kevin saw it first and lunged for the bank, grabbing vegetation and pulling himself out of the current. He made it. He reached back for Yossi. Yossi and the raft went over the falls. The drop sent him through a canyon, the river pulling him under repeatedly, slamming him against rocks, filling his lungs with brown water, before releasing him long enough to breathe, and then pulling him under again. The ride lasted 15 minutes. When it finally released him onto a gravel bank, bloodied and gasping, he lay there long enough to understand that he had survived. Then the second understanding arrived. Kevin was somewhere upstream, and Yossi was somewhere downstream, and between them was an unnavigable section of river in a jungle with no paths, no landmarks, no way out that he could see in any direction. He was alone. The jungle at night was a thing he had not prepared for. The canopy sealed out the stars and the moon entirely. The darkness was absolute. Not the darkness of a room with the lights off, but a darkness with texture and weight, alive with sound. Things moved in it that he couldn't see. He had no gun, no knife, no map. He had the prayer booklet. The days that followed were a systematic dismantling of everything a person takes for granted. He ran out of the rice he'd been carrying within days. He survived on fruit when he could find it, on bird eggs foraged from jungle nests, on whatever the forest offered. His feet began to go. The constant moisture and the rot, a fungus eating through the skin, turning the soles to something bleeding and raw that made every step a negotiation between the will to move and the pain of moving. He waded through swamps where he sank to his waist in quicksand and had to drag himself out by grabbing at roots. He walked through army ant swarms that tore at his skin from his eyelids to his ankles, leaving him a map of tiny wounds. On his 6th night alone, he heard something moving around his camp in the dark. Something large, something that moved with the specific, deliberate patience of an apex predator, a jaguar, circling. He improvised a flamethrower from an insect-repellent canister and a lighter, waving fire into the darkness until the circling stopped. On another night, a flash flood hit while he was sleeping on a riverbank. The water came fast and without warning, lifting him off the ground and carrying him through the forest in the dark, branches tearing at him, the current too strong to fight. He grabbed a tree, held on, waited for the water to recede. It did. He was still alive. He lay in the mud and did not understand why. By the 3rd week, his body was losing the argument his mind was still trying to win. The feet were critically infected. He was hallucinating, seeing a woman walking beside him in the jungle, hearing voices, losing track of where he was in time. He had been eating almost nothing for days. The weight was gone from him in a way that felt structural, as if the jungle had been removing him piece by piece, testing to see what remained. What remained on a riverbank he had collapsed onto was a young man barely conscious in the mud when he heard the sound of a boat motor. Kevin had made it out. Kevin had reached the nearest settlement, told them what had happened, and refused to leave. He hired Bolivian river guides and a boat and went back into the jungle. The guides had given up. The search area was too vast, the jungle too dense. But the river was too narrow to turn the boat around at the point where they reached it, so they were forced to continue upstream to a wider section. The place where they could finally turn the boat happened to be the stretch of riverbank where Yossi had collapsed. Out of the entire Bolivian Amazon, Kevin's boat came to the only bank where Yossi was lying. Yossi heard the motor. Kevin saw him. It was over. Marcus Stam and Karl Ruprechter were never found. Search parties went in. Nothing came back. Somewhere in the Bolivian Amazon, the jungle took them and kept them, the way the jungle keeps everything it is given. Yossi Ghinsberg recovered. He went back to Bolivia 10 years later, not as a survivor returning to the site of his trauma, but as someone who understood that the jungle had given him something as well as taken from him. He helped build a sustainable ecotourism village there, owned and run by the local indigenous people, which is still operating today. He became a speaker, a writer, a man for whom the Amazon became not the thing that almost killed him, but the thing that taught him everything he knew about staying alive. He still carries the prayer booklet. If you enjoy bizarre true stories like this, be sure to subscribe and turn on notifications. See you on the next one.